Welcome to Healed to Heal, the podcast that champions radical faith, confronts unbelief, and amplifies a single truth. Jesus still heals. He always has. He never stopped. So whether you're still lying on the mat or carrying someone else to Jesus, this is for you. Hi, friends, and welcome back to the Healed to Heal podcast. Today's episode is super special because we're welcoming back a guest whose powerful story has impacted so many of you. And before, we didn't get a chance to have him on video, but today you get to see the man behind the story. And for those of you who did not get to hear our previous conversation, you're going to hear parts of two incredible moments from Mick's life. So Mick Weinholt survived a devastating avalanche that by all accounts should have ended his life, but didn't. And not only that, but he and his wife lost their son Luke just a few days before he was supposed to be born. He was delivered, but the story is not about the devastation. It's about the way that Mick responded to it and the way that God worked through this situation. And we here are not just about the things that we go through, but how we can be healed from something if we turn to God, and then how God can work all things together for good for us. So today we're not only going to talk about those stories, we're going to talk about what happens after that, like how his faith has grown over the years and how his wonderful podcast, When You Look, has been able to impact people and inspire them. So thank you so much for being willing to come on this show, Mick. Welcome.
Yeah, Kathleen, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on as a guest, truly.
Well, absolutely. Like we just said, let's go back to these two stories, and let's start with the story of the avalanche. Can you just give us a little bit of that picture? What were you doing on that mountain? How did that come about?
Yeah, and a tiny bit of backstory here so that everybody can understand why I was such a crazy, basically silly, we'll call them, like nonsense-driven, young adult. And I'm 19 at this point in my life, and I'm really driven by ego. And I decide, after living in greater Denver, Colorado for a little more than a year, and during that year or so, I had done a lot of outdoor activities, lots of hiking, lots of climbing, ice climbing, all kinds of different stuff, right? And I decided, based on my ego, that I was going to go climb peaks that I had previously hiked. And so there's two peaks outside of Denver called Grays and Torreys. They're both 14,000 foot peaks. And so my ego said, hey, go do something better. And so I get to the bottom of the climb up this snow gully or snow couloir. Think of like a chute that people would ski down, that the really, really steep stuff, say at the top of a ski resort. I like to climb that stuff. I was never a great skier, so I wanted to climb it. And I was about 200 to 300 feet vertically up this actual climb. And as I'm ascending it, Kathleen, of course, I'm moving the snow around because there's a person on the snow slope, And as a result of what I was doing in disturbing the snow, it actually disturbed a pretty significant portion of the slope. And so I triggered the avalanche that swept me to the bottom. And so very distinctly, I can remember hearing this whoomph sound, looking up and realizing, okay, this is an avalanche, and watching the snow slide towards me. And of course, this is all happening in probably a second and a half or so, you know what I mean? Maximum of 2 seconds, because this is all happening in real time, in action, and I attempted to move perpendicular to the sliding snow. And I got 1 foot in that direction, 1 step in that direction, and was swept off my feet. And as I was swept off my feet, I remember thinking to myself, this is going to suck for my family, especially my mom.
Yeah.
And then I went unconscious.
That is so crazy. And you think about something like that and you see movies about it and you just, you imagine how crazy, because so many people do perish from that because they have to dig out and stuff, right? But that wasn't your story. And it does really seem like divine intervention. Can you tell us what happened when you came to?
Yeah. So first off, to your point, right, I came to, okay, like meaning I'm knocked unconscious, but then after some period of elapsed time, I don't know how long it was, I came to at the bottom, and I'm not buried underneath the snow. I'm not even in some precarious situation, meaning like my arm isn't underneath of me. I'm not face down. I'm not face up. My leg isn't mangled. I literally, Kathleen, was placed. I think I was placed on a rock. So I come to literally as I'm sitting on a rock. My feet are below me. My head is up the hill, and I literally just sit up.
Yeah.
And I realize I'm kind of okay. All systems seem to be a go. And that became then the operative word that I needed to go. So I hike the 3 miles back to the parking lot. And during that period of time, I'm sort of doing a bit of self-assessment of like what's going on. I'm spitting blood. I got blood dripping into my eye. And I get all the way back to the parking lot, and there is another guy standing in the parking lot.
Yeah. Perfect timing, right? Like it couldn't have been more perfect.
Exactly. And as it turns out, that guy's name is Steve, and Steve had arrived in the parking lot, as he describes it, 30 seconds before I walked in.
Wow.
So I walk into the parking lot, see this guy, Steve. He says to me, "What happened to you?" And I said, "I was in an avalanche." Like, very matter of fact, like, isn't it obvious? You know what I mean? And he is very persistent in following me and eventually convincing me to let him take me to the hospital. And for sure, if Steve is not there, I end up dying in that parking lot.
Yeah. Wow. And there was a story too, like you had, like your key was not with you, but you had an extra one, right? Like if that hadn't been there, that would have been another problem.
Yeah, so that kind of adds a little bit more dimension to why I can say with confidence that I would have died there. So my standard practice for everybody that's listening is I always locked my keys in my pickup truck, because underneath of the pickup truck bed, I kept a spare key so that I could always access my vehicle in the event that while something was going on in my time in the backcountry, if I lost my backpack, let's just make this up. Like if I had to throw my backpack at a bear or a mountain lion or something, right? But I could make my way back to my vehicle, then my keys would be at my vehicle. That was sort of the reasoning behind what I did. But what I realized standing there in front of my vehicle is that I could not, based on my blood loss and my lack of strength, I couldn't get down on the ground and shimmy underneath to get the key and then back out and stand back up. I just knew intuitively I didn't have the strength for that. So Steve was gracious enough to help with that. And then when we gained access to my vehicle, because I was really at that point trying to get in my car to drive my car, but also to get my really warm down jacket, when we realized that I didn't have the strength to get my zipper down from the jacket that I was wearing, it was very clear to me that I needed to let Steve take me to the hospital because of the condition that I was in.
Well, that's interesting too, because it makes me think of your comment about the time in your life when it was about ego, it was about I can handle this. This was also pivotal for our listeners that didn't hear the story before, because at this point you didn't have a strong faith in God. So this impacted you in a lot of ways, right? Like a lot of people have something like that happen and they just go completely south. Everybody responds differently, but how you responded is really important for our listeners to hear.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I had essentially no faith. I grew up in what I considered to be a Christian household. I was put through 1st through 12th grade in Christian-based education. But I need to be very clear with everybody that I intentionally did not have a relationship with Jesus. I intentionally did not have a relationship with God. I wanted nothing to do with the Trinity, period. And this isn't ignorance creating lack of relationship. This is willful distance, right? And so, I'm basically healed in 3 weeks. I'm back to college. I'm back into the workforce after 3 weeks. My jaw was broken on both sides. My skull was fractured in 3 places. I had to have emergency brain surgery because all of the trauma that had occurred in the avalanche occurred to my head. So 3 weeks is not a long time.
Yeah.
And I didn't give God really any credit for what had occurred other than just this intellectual assigning of it was quote unquote a miracle.
Right.
Like I believed in this very high level sense that God had saved me because I knew it was miraculous, but I had no understanding of the depth of that. And it also did not bring me into or move me in the direction of any faith with God, period.
Right. Well, what was it that started turning your mind toward God? I know later on when you got married. Just tell us leading up to the second story, which must have been incredibly heartbreaking.
Yeah. Well, and that's really what what began the relationship and the life change. So, I was 19 in the avalanche, and we need to fast forward to when I'm 31. And that 12-year gap is really me in the same mode. Willful rebellion against God, creating as much distance between him and me, and then later my wife and I and him.
Yeah.
And we get to the point where we've now started to plan for a family. We get pregnant, and our first pregnancy is a baby boy. And the due date for him is January 11th. And on January 4th, so exactly 1 week before his due date, we go to labor and delivery because my wife has not felt him move since the prior night, and multiple ultrasound machines, multiple ultrasound techs, and then finally the MD who says what we at that point knew, which is, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your baby no longer has a heartbeat. And it was the realization at that point. There's this intersection that's happening at that point, Kathleen. There's the realization in my brain and then very rapidly in my heart, okay, that up to that point in my life as a 31-year-old man, I had been able to overcome every challenge, every problem that I had ever come across, okay? It might have taken a little bit of coaching from someone, a little bit of a helping hand, maybe a few extra dollars, but through a little DIY and a lot of grit, I would basically be able to overcome any obstacle that I had encountered up to that point in my life. And I realized there was no way that I could fix a dead baby.
Yeah.
And that's by God's grace that realization was occurring then. And so as a result of that realization and the impact and the physical, emotional weight of the grief, I am on my knees in the hallway of the hospital crying out to this God that I knew about, but had purposefully never had any relationship with, because I knew it was beyond me. And so I surrendered. Literally, I was like, I need you. We need you. I can't do this. And that was 14 plus years ago. And my life has been changed and changing ever since, as he has truly begun to heal us.
Yeah. That's so powerful and so inspiring. I mean, there's so many parts of a person's life where you look back and you realize God was trying to speak to me, but I wasn't listening or I couldn't hear. But in that moment of humility and surrender, you realize that he really was there and that he was able to comfort you and you and your wife as well. So out of that, over a period of time, you not only started seeking him, but you eventually decided to take the things that you'd learn and share with people around you. And of course, Heal to Heal that's exactly what that's about. Tell us how When You Look came into being. How did that unfold?
Yeah, so really, really neat and wild story. The full backstory, which we'll touch on very quickly, is that in 2020, okay, February of 2020, I'm on a mission trip in Niger, Africa.
Oh, cool.
And after a typical day of mission work and outreach, at the orphanage or the feeding program that we were at, we would have dinner and then we would debrief as a mission team. And we debriefed on the rooftop of this building. And so we would talk about the highs of the day, the lows of the days, and things that we had learned. And then we would break out individually into prayer time. And we had worship music playing at that point so that everybody could kind of have their privacy, if you will, as we are spread across the top of this building in the dark. And in those moments, quite literally, I had what I consider to be this face-to-face encounter with God. Now, I did not see God, okay?
Yeah.
I'm in no way trying to profess that, but the reason I call it face-to-face is because it was me and him, and I was totally consumed by him. Now, I've been in relationship with Jesus at this point for 8+ years, okay, from 2012 now to 2020. And so there'd been regular communication between him and I in terms of prayer and the nudging of the Holy Spirit, a whisper here, a whisper there, the confirmation of an answered prayer, that type of what I'll consider to be normal types of communication. This was a whole different level.
Yeah.
And what he communicated to me was, he says, you're my guy for testimonies. And Kathleen, this was totally my Moses moment, because my response was, I'm not your guy.
Not your guy.
And he says it again. He goes, you're my guy for testimonies. And I said, I'm not your guy. There's got to be somebody else. Now, I don't have a brother named Aaron, but I was totally saying, like, there's literally got to be somebody else.
No,
and
send somebody else. Yeah.
Exactly. And on the third time of him saying, "You're my guy for testimonies," I relented and said, "I don't know what that means, but I will do it." And so as we fast forward, then the idea for When You Look as a podcast began to take shape in 2023. And then it really became clear from God's direction at the beginning of 2025 that this was to actually happen. And so When You Look got launched in early 2025, and God has blessed it immeasurably since then.
Love so many of the stories, and each one of them is so unique because God deals with each one of us in a very unique way. Of course, that's what he does. But two things about what you just said that really stood out to me. One is we like to have everything on a spreadsheet, like, God, give me the whole thing from step 1, step 2, step 3. But of course, that's not the way it works, right? Like, you have to say yes before you know what a lot of those other things are. And that takes courage, right? Like, what would you say to somebody that maybe feels led to do something by God, but feels overwhelmed by that?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. Well, I would encourage them to give consideration to this really foundational fact, and that is that God is God and we are not.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is when there is a direction that you feel like you are being prompted to take, man, he created us. He created you, created me, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Kind of incumbent upon us to take those steps in faith. And then I can also say from experience, and I'm sure you can as well, like we've all of us that are listening, all of us that are watching have gone through or are in the midst of JUNK, right?
Yeah. That's
And
well
yet
said.
we know that God has been with us. And so what I can say from experience is that there have been super scary times. There have been times that my faith has been grown and it has been far less scary, but every single moment of that, he has been in and he has provided. And by provision, I mean, sometimes it's dollars and cents provision.
Yeah.
Most of the time it's peace provision and the growing of faith and the ability just to continue to move forward.
Yeah. I love that. It makes me think too, like, I think sometimes we forget we have a struggle and we're like, we finally ask God and then we're like, God, that's over. Don't have to worry about trusting God. Whoops. No, he wants it to be walking with him like all the time. Like, if we could get that, right? And stop waiting, be like, oh, okay, well, I don't need God for this. No, we need him all the time, every minute, every day, and through everything. Like, and I see that in people like you that have had an experience that has brought them spiritual maturity. Not to try to go off and do something on your own, and to start leaning on him. But we have to continue to grow in that because the natural tendency is the opposite, right? Just to not even think about that. But I love that. It's branch on the vine. Well, take us to some of your experiences with this podcast. I mean, you uncover in this experiences that people have, and you're very balanced. I love that. You're not shoving any kind of theology down anybody's throat, but you're allowing them to see through real experiences, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, the premise behind When You Look is really this idea and this belief that God is in all things and in every story when you look. Because we could look, the collective we can look at a particular thing. I'll give a quick example. So I have an episode 12 is where a man has had a heart attack, and the paramedics in the episode explain that this man was without a heartbeat, no pulse, for 30. Now, 6 days later, out of the hospital, he walks under his total own power and control. And as he describes in his own words, 3 weeks later, he is basically back to full capacity.
Wow.
Now,
that's incredible.
We can look at that and say, okay, well, there was medical intervention in this. And so we had roughly half of the guests that were involved in that whole thing that were on the show say this was a total medical thing, coincidence, right people, right time, all of that type of stuff. And then we had another half of the people, including the paramedics, that just flat out said, this is a miracle.
Yeah.
And so I would love for everybody to confess Christ, but we can each look at a particular thing and see it differently. And so on When You Look, we hold the space for that. Because, Jesus is very clear, right? When you seek, you will find. And so we're borrowing from that in terms of like, look, when you look, there's a pretty good chance you're going to see God in it because we believe he's in all things. Yeah. And so the stories have really just been wonderful because nearly all of our episodes intentionally are where people just like you are sharing their firsthand account So we don't do secondhand stories. There's so many wonderful stories that I know of that folks have just said, hey, I'm not ready to share that publicly yet. And so I can't share that. And I'm okay with that because it's like, hey, let's have the person who experienced it share their story. And then let's let people decide, was it coincidence or God?
Well, that's incredible. And I love the power of testimony. That's something that I share a strong belief in. You know, it says that they overcame him, the enemy, the dragon, by the word of their testimony and by the blood of the Lamb. We overcome because when people see that God is working in somebody else's life, that's one of the ways that we come to faith, right? There's other ways that we do as well. But it's really hard to argue with that. It's hard to argue with a changed life. I mean,
That's it.
because we're always ready to argue these things. But the other thing that I absolutely love, and I just confirm it, one of the reasons I have you back on the show is because when you look, I think is such a central thing. Whatever we put our focus on, you know, E. Stanley Jones has a quote that says, whatever gets your attention gets you. And I think that's so true. Where are you looking? Because where you're looking, that is going to determine a lot of times where you're going. And so I love that about you. So tell us, you know, in the years, where do you see all this going in the future? What do you think God has put on your heart to continue to expand this ministry?
Wow. You know, that's a really wonderful question and a really interesting one. The direction that we have right now from the Holy Spirit is more of what we're currently doing. He's blessed us beyond belief with, you know, numbers of episodes. So just so that the rubber meets the road on that, you know, as you and I are recording and roughly when we expect this conversation to be public, we're sitting on right around episode 60 or so for when you look. And yet even already recorded, we're beyond episode 90 and have many, many more already scheduled. So it's an indication because as mentioned, right, these are firsthand accounts. So I'm not able to manufacture an episode, right? So this is an indication of God's blessing that just more and more stories continue to come. But we're also having a lot of other conversations, my wife and I, praying about whether or not a community related to When You Look should, you know, begin to take shape and take form and see what the Holy Spirit would do for that. So could be a lot of really cool stuff coming down the road.
Okay, well, wonderful. Well, a few more questions. One, is there another story or maybe that comes to mind? Each one of them is incredible, but is there any story that really surprised you or that you think would be interesting to share with our guests?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of them. So I'll just highlight a handful of them, you know,
sure.
and it drives home a really neat lesson for me that I think others that are listening may appreciate. You know, so as we read through the Bible or pick up a Bible story here and there, you know what I mean, through church, I think it's really easy to think or even conclude, well, that was then.
Yeah.
You know, and a good example of this would be, you know, Jesus's early life that we don't have much of account of at all, but his early life is actually in Egypt.
Yeah.
And it's in Egypt because his father is warned in a dream, get up and go to Egypt, right? And it's like, okay, cool. Total Bible story is an easy conclusion for that, right? Warned in a dream, okay? Well, I've got actual episodes where people have been communicated in present day, modern day through dreams. And it began to make me think, it's like, wow, man, the same things that happened in the Bible then are happening now, you know? And it really began to expand what I thought was possible in modern day. It wasn't as if I didn't believe that God could do anything, but I think subconsciously I sort of like put certain things in a box. You know what I mean? Exactly. As I mentioned before, that episode of the person who doesn't have a pulse for 38 minutes, it's easy to process that as, okay, well, he ended up in a hospital and he's alive now.
Yeah.
But if we step back from that, you know what that is? That's a modern day resurrection.
Yeah,
because
it really
38 minutes without a pulse with a man who is completely healthy afterwards, that's modern day resurrection.
Yeah.
And I've had other guests on my show where they have had a similar experience to me. And what I mean by that is that they have had a stillbirth, a late-term stillbirth, and up to that point, like me, they weren't a Christian. And it's the death of their child that brings them into relationship with Christ, right? And so I've had non-Christians, people that are full on, I was an atheist, had no relationship, didn't even really understand that God exists, say, I was in the hospital room, totally alone, totally panicked, and I just started praying. And then I heard the audible voice of God. And so what these stories have done for me, and I think for our listeners as well, is they have affirmed the following, Kathleen, that God is alive and well, that the King is on the move. And here's the thing that I really, really, really hope people hear. Even when we hate God, he still loves us.
Yeah, that's so powerful.
I have evidence of that in my own life, and I have episode after episode of that exact same thing. I mean, we've got folks that something that they were planning to do was really bad.
Yeah.
And God prevents that from happening. And it's only later that they see that that was God preventing that out of his love for them. But when they're about to go do that bad thing, they're not a Christian. They don't have any relationship. They don't like God. They don't love Jesus. There's nothing there. And what has been so neat to me is to see that theme in story after story after story. I mean, the one that I'll just close with is I've had multiple people say, I have literally had a firearm in my mouth. I've literally pulled the trigger and nothing has happened.
That's insane.
Exactly.
That's insane. Wow. There's so many things about what you just said that speak to me, but I think the patience and mercy of God, because we have such a tendency to have such a hard heart. You know, there's a verse that says that some people, even if people are raised from the dead, they will not believe. And so I think, you know, it's an admonition to all of us to look again, to open our heart and our mind to the miraculous, to the ways that God is working, and to realize the word tells us that there are tender mercies every day, but we need to see them. We need to look at them. And that's wonderful, because that's what you're doing. You're helping connect people with the thing that's already there. It's there if you're looking for it. What would you say as an encouragement to somebody today that is wondering about these things?
Yeah, I think it's that exactly what we were talking about moments ago. Even when we don't feel like we got a great position with God, maybe we are seeking him, it doesn't seem like much is happening, or maybe we are literally like, I hate God. I can't believe that I ended up listening to this podcast that my friend sent me. He loves you. And if that is hard to believe, I can relate to that. I really can relate to that. But on the flip side of that, on the other side of that, I can tell you with deep sincerity from lived experience that it really is true. Like he loved me even when I hated him. And that character of his, of love, even when there's separation, is true for all of us.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And here you have it to all of our listeners. It says in the word, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. And Mick Weinholt is someone who is a redeemed of the Lord who's telling his story. And it's just like, made me think of C.S. Lewis, who said, pain is God's megaphone to a deaf world. A lot of times he reaches us through the pain. It doesn't always mean he orchestrated that, but he can work through that in a way that sometimes we'll never get it any other way. And so thank you, Mick, for telling us your story. Where do we go to find your work?
Yeah, so When You Look is available on all of the podcast platforms, including YouTube. WhenYouLook.com is a great place to start. You can also communicate with me there as well. But we are video first, and so you can find us on YouTube at When You Look Show. We're on Instagram and Facebook in those same handles, and again, across all of the podcast platforms.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's been incredible, and glad that our listeners get to see your wonderful face. And for all of you, I hope that this message today inspires you and comforts you and lifts you up. And remember that this is where you come to receive healing and then carry that healing to the world. Healed to heal. Thank you.